Charles in charge.
I'm Eric, for anyone listening.
Hello, world. This is the Know Your Place podcast, and we have Eric on here. Where are you from, Eric?
I'm from Toronto, Canada.
And Eric wanted to come on and join us to talk about the Great Lakes. Actually, this is a rehash of episode 5, in a way. I talked about Great Lakes supremacy, but somebody asked me, well, what's the difference between the Canadian and American side? So I've been itching to get Eric on.
Okay, so let's get to it.
Let's get to it. I'll let you start, Eric. Tell us about growing up in sort of Toronto, Ontario, and all that great stuff.
So I'm around 24, I think. So I grew up around the 1990s, early 2000s. Growing up in the Toronto was very interesting because we're sort of like we're near the border with the U.S. So there's a lot of influence from the U.S. Culturally, we watch a lot of American shows, listen to a lot of American music, but we also have our own thing. We're influenced by Canada by Canadian culture to an extent, but there's like a unique identity to Toronto, especially since over the last few years we've become more and more multicultural and international oriented. So it's sort of like, I guess, I always like to compare it to like a smaller version of New York City, where it's basically the financial and cultural center of the country, and there's a sense both within Toronto and outside of Toronto that everyone here is a bit elitist. That people in Toronto don't care about people outside in the rest of Canada, let alone people in the rest of Ontario, for example. That was like a big theme in the last few elections. And I have we have a mutual friend from Vancouver. She always talks about like there's a big contrast between Eastern and Western Canada, and how we often feel like two separate countries. And in some cases, we feel closer to the United States, but the eastern part, whereas Western Canada feels closer to California or Seattle area.
Yeah, I would say all those things you said are sort of fair in what my perception is of Toronto.
Yeah.
I guess the biggest characters I think of when it comes to Toronto are people like Drake and Rob Ford.
Oh yeah, Rob Ford was he was a character. His brother is running our province right now.
Yeah, I've heard, which that kind of surprised me because, as I said in episode 5, I always found the Canadian side of the Great Lakes to be, I don't know how to construe it, slightly more liberal than the American side.
Yeah, I guess it really depends on where you go, but generally we are certainly more socially liberal. But I think than say like the American Midwest, for example.
Right.
But economically, we're around the same area. I think we we would more likely vote for someone who is economically populist.
Right. Yeah.
But we are just, I guess, more pro gay marriage and more pro choice than your side of the Great Lakes. But otherwise, we have a lot in common in that sense.
Yeah.
Because
Now is how
because the
meaning. I'll let you go
yeah,
ahead. Finish your
yeah,
thought. That's
basically
okay.
because there used to be a big manufacturing sector in Ontario, just like in the Rust Belt. So in recent years, as we become more deindustrialized, there's a similar sentiment growing in Ontario that's paralleled in the rest of North America.
Yeah, I'm always stunned all the stuff you've been sharing with me lately. It seems like you all are becoming more and more like the American side of the Great Lakes,
Yeah,
and that's kind of crazy.
yeah, because I would say back before the 1960s, it was very British here in terms of
Right.
in terms of the culture, in terms of our association, in terms of our allegiance. We were very pro British. We were pro Commonwealth. But around the 1960s or 1970s, I guess around the time Great Britain began to decline as a world power, we became closer to the United States, especially around the Cold War area, and we began to be influenced by American mass culture and the American economy to such an extent that we're part of the American market essentially in many cases.
Yeah,
So
and of
you
course
have
you
a lot of
have pro teams in Toronto from American
yeah
sports, like the Raptors and things
yeah
like that.
yeah. So you have a lot of exchange going on, but I would say in some cases it's very unequal, and that's where a lot of the issue with NAFTA comes in, because there's actually a lot of opposition to NAFTA in Canada, which I find very strange because NAFTA tends to be more favorable to the United States in some areas, but in other areas it tends to be more favorable to Canada. So in both cases, we feel shortchanged.
Well, everybody feels sort of shortchanged by the United States.
Yeah,
So,
that's true to an extent.
Ramstein made this song. I don't know if you've heard it. It's called America. And in there they go, "We're all living in America." And that was supposed to mean that everything's been Americanized, including Germany, where Ramstein
Yeah,
is.
yeah,
So,
basically, especially since a lot of the post-war influence when Europe was basically being rebuilt and a lot of American industry went to Europe, a lot of American influence went there as well. And the same thing is happening in Japan, and even in some former English colonies like India. There's a lot of Americanization that's happening as a byproduct of industrialization.
well, cool. So, as you know, I'm from Wisconsin, and I would say, in a way, I would say Wisconsin's probably a little different than Ontario. Uh,
Yeah, I'd say it's more insular than Ontario.
yes.
Even though they're both around the same area, we're more connected to the rest of the world, whereas Wisconsin is more doing its own thing.
Yeah, I would say Wisconsin's always kind of been one of those states that does its own thing to a degree. Um, but so I like growing up, there's a lot of pride people take in the Packers and the cheese, and I wouldn't say a lot of people really think of themselves as world citizens in Wisconsin.
Yeah. I is there? Do you think that there's that sense around Detroit, or is that not really comparable to Toronto in that sense? Because I know
That's a
that
sticky
tends to be a
question.
thing in big cities, like
Yeah,
in
I
big
mean, go ahead. I'll let you
yeah,
finish your
like
thought.
in big cities. No matter where you are, there's generally more of a connection to the rest of the world. But I would say even less so in Wisconsin than in other places in North America.
Yeah, in the Detroit example, it's very interesting you bring them up. I would say it actually used to be a bigger sense in the 50s when the car companies were at their peak and it had things like Motown and things. But I would say it's slowly been declining their sense of being a world city, whereas Chicago has always had that sense to a degree.
Yeah, that's why you always like to compare it to Toronto and Chicago.
Yeah. They're just one the same, man. You
Yeah.
can't separate them.
Well, they're not exactly the same, but yeah, they do have a lot of commonalities.
Yes. Well, and of course, they filmed the movie Chicago in
Yeah,
Toronto, so
yeah.
they
Basically,
look the same.
a lot of movies that take place in LA are filmed in Vancouver. A lot of movies that take place in New York or Chicago are filmed in Toronto.
I guess it's just too expensive to film movies in
Yeah,
the United States anymore.
yeah. Basically, cheap labor and stuff.
Yes. I guess that's one of the other great things we're mooching off of Canada. No.
Yeah, damn welfare queens.
All right, cool. So let's see. So when I think of Toronto, like I said, I think of Drake. I do think of you all as the main cultural city in Canada. I will say that. My dad actually went there once when I was a kid. He had a great time. He went to the big tower and sort of toured it. It was really funny. My dad was named Roger, and his friend in Toronto was also Roger. So they were making all these jokes about being opposite sides of the lakes.
Yeah,
So, but yeah, I mean, you are an example of what you talk about with Toronto being a multicultural place. You're a multicultural person, are you not?
yeah. To an extent, in the sense that I come from two different immigrant backgrounds, Italian and Indian, and those are two of the I think bigger communities in Toronto. There tend to be a lot of different ethnic enclaves in Toronto that have a lot of influence or in, or tend to dominate our political landscape. I think the largest are maybe the Indian community, Chinese community, Ukrainian community, and the uh, uh, and the Polish community. A
Oh,
lot of
Polish people.
yeah, a lot of Eastern Europeans came to Toronto. The Italians used to be prominent in Toronto, but they tend to have moved out to the suburban area, and they're not no longer that prominent in the city itself.
This is sounding exactly like Chicago, man.
Yeah. Well,
But
there's
yeah,
a,
so that's very interesting. How did your families end up in Toronto? Because I have to say, when I think of Canada, I don't generally think of Italians and Indians.
so basically, my mom comes from a village in southern Italy, and they moved a bit all over. They went to France, then they went to Montreal, mostly because there were more economic opportunities there than post-war Italy. And that's where my mom met my dad. My dad came from India because at that time there were a lot of people from India coming to Canada. It's mostly, I guess, being another country that spoke English and that was in the Commonwealth, that they wanted to, that people who didn't go to the United Kingdom, they would move to Canada if they wanted to have a better economic opportunity.
Yes,
So
I'm very shocked at the Canadian economy.
yeah,
I haven't, because when I think of it, I just think of such a, I don't want to be too stereotypical, but a desolate place.
yeah, historically that was true. Like if you look at the economic data for Canada until like 1950, we're basically a third world country. But like there was no economic production outside of Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal, and maybe a few mining towns. That was basically the Canadian economy. And then after the 1950s, there was a boom, much like in many other places uh, in the Western world, like Australia, for example. Australia and Canada were both settled in a very small area, and the rest of the country was just empty, basically. And because of that, for the longest time, there was a very low economic output, and we were mostly dependent on Britain economically, which is why a lot of times there was opposition to trade with the United States. Which is kind of ironic because what eventually happened was the big fear of the founders of Canada. They were afraid that we would get dominated by the U.S. markets and we wouldn't be able to get British goods anymore, which is exactly what happened. So it's kind of funny. It's kind
They
of funny
foresaw.
that their fear came to pass, even though that was the entire reason we were established, essentially.
Well,
Because
and it's ironic you say that because our founding fathers probably feared us becoming too involved in world affairs and not being able to make our own decisions anymore, which is pretty much what we've become in a way.
yeah, yeah, you tend to be involved in a lot of different conflicts around the world, which is exactly the opposite of what a lot of founding fathers said. Yeah, it's very interesting how both of our countries have tended to drift from our founding principles.
Yeah, I don't know, it's very scary. It's an interesting debate because, like you said, to where I was born, Wisconsin has a legacy of sort of being insular in a way, right? But at the same time, you don't want to be too insular, you
Yeah,
know.
yeah, you need to have a balance. You can't on the one hand be involved in poking your nose in everything and trying and basically going to places where you're not welcome, but at the same time you can't be completely separate from everyone else and have no idea what's going on.
Yeah, I don't know what the balance is there, but you know my political leanings, so
Yeah,
yeah. Anyway, so okay, so when you grew up, so am I under the impression you all actually have three parties? You've had three parties for a
yeah.
long time.
We have three major parties: the Liberal Party, the Conservative Party, and the New Democratic Party. Historically, the Liberal Party would sort of be oscillate between classical liberal and social liberal, but recently they would be more social liberal, especially under Trudeau. And the Conservative Party historically was ironically more protectionist than the Liberal Party was, but recently they've become more aligned with the American conservative tradition. So there's a bit of a reversal.
I just find that very fascinating. Not because we have had third parties over the years, but none of
Yeah,
them have really stuck, if you will. And of
yeah,
course, both of our major parties have totally flipped their positions over the years.
yeah. And as for the NDP, the New Democratic Party grew out of the labor and agrarian movement of the 1930s and 1940s. I think that was around the same time as the Progressive Era in the U.S. But
Yes.
because we were much more agricultural at that time, I guess that party had got more power and influence compared to the rest of the population. Most of the base of this party would probably be in Western Canada, which is actually similar to, I guess, the U.S. Progressive Movement, which had a lot of support, if I remember, in the Midwest.
Oh yes.
Yeah, like
Actually, Wisconsin voted in a or one time they had this character named Fighting Bob La Follette, and he won Wisconsin's electoral votes for president in like 1928.
you guys have such interesting names. Fighting Bob.
Fighting Bob.
Yeah, and then if I remember, William Jennings Bryan, who is sort of like a bit like the NDP now,
Oh yes, he
but
would
more
be almost
certainly
like a
more,
Bernie Sanders character.
yeah, sort of like that, but I guess more socially conservative at that point
More
compared
socially
to
conservative and more agrarian than Bernie
yeah, but
Sanders.
definitely in the same populist progressive vein. Uh, both that kind of politician and the NDP get their support from rural areas in Canada. But increasingly so, there's a lot of growing support among millennial and student voters in Canada, as many of them are becoming more, I guess, more politically polarized, both in the left and the right. More of them are going to the NDP or the Conservative Party. Fewer are going to the Liberal Party among
Yes.
people under 30.
That's very interesting. And the thing I find interesting, and this is sort of what I said in episode 5, is in some ways, you guys, I would say, on your side, are less sort of populated than the Great Lakes side. But again, just that the agricultural people in Canada are very socialist almost to a degree.
Yeah, economically, they certainly are. In fact, I think one of the foundations of the modern Conservative Party is the Reform Party, in which grew in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. They basically became a Western protest movement. They were against the policies which hurt farmers and workers in Western Canada. Even though they were socially conservative, they were a bit economically populist. But then there was this movement to unite all the right wing parties in Canada. The major party at that time was the Progressive Conservatives, who were a bit more, I guess, establishment conservative types. And they both joined together under the new Conservative Party of Canada, and that's how they were formed. So even though they eventually joined the Conservative Party, there's this strong protest movement that remains in the West throughout Canadian history.
Yes, it's very fascinating and sort of steering us towards the Great Lakes. See, the biggest difference I see is that, you all having Toronto being the main influence in your side of the Great Lakes in your country. In America, Chicago, jokes about being the second city. It's not the main influencer. So often growing up and, being around my family in Wisconsin, we would just see both people from the East Coast and the West Coast as almost foreigners to us.
Yeah, that sort of reminded me about during the election, Ted Cruz's line about New York values.
Yes, that
How people from New York and LA don't relate to people in America, basically.
yes, and to a degree he was right, but the problem is a character like that is only saying a soundbite. Do they really mean that?
Yeah,
Like, are they really going to champion those people?
yeah. A lot of it is just acting, I think.
Right. Yes, but yeah, I mean, no, totally. Like my uncle one time made this offhanded comment about how he lives in a suburb of Milwaukee that's 15 minutes from downtown Milwaukee, and it's a pretty urban place. Milwaukee's actually the uh, most dense urban region in the Great Lakes on the American side, which
More
is very
more dense than Chicago.
yes, in the like very tight spot,
I
believe it or
see.
not. Yeah, but overall, I mean, obviously, there's more people in Chicago and
Yeah,
Detroit, but
makes sense.
yeah. So anyway, he was anyway. It's really funny. So somebody moved in next door, and they were from Massachusetts, and he was just totally peeved with them.
Oh wow.
Even though
That's
he's left wing, like he's part of a union and votes Democrat, but he
yeah.
was like,
Yeah, that's kind of funny.
yeah, he was like, no, no, don't like these Massachusetts types.
Yeah, that's actually very similar to a lot of NDP voters in Alberta. They're a lot like conservative voters in Alberta in that they don't like anyone from Eastern Canada.
They're like, yeah, here, go away.
Yeah, and it's sort of funny that sort of manifested in the whole pipeline dispute, where everyone in Eastern Canada and everyone in BC was basically opposed to the pipeline, but Alberta supported the pipeline, and the federal government didn't want to alienate Alberta, so they also supported the pipeline. So there
Oh
was this
man.
sense of the pipeline being like an example of a division between Eastern and Western Canada.
Yeah,
And
we had sort of the converse problem with that pipeline,
yeah,
where most of the people in the area, or most of the people in the government, kind of supported it, and there's just these outsiders coming in, protesting.
yeah.
So, but yeah, no, that's interesting. I don't know. Do you feel? So, do you feel like I don't know? Are you? Do you have a? It's weird because you think of you like you said you're kind of like the New York City of Canada. So, do you feel like you need to like apologize to the rest of Canada, or like you need to be nice to them or something?
I'm not sure if we feel like we have to be nice, but there's definitely that sense that we don't care about the rest of Canada, and we always have to say that we actually do care about them because there's this prejudice, like again, like I said, against Toronto, that people in Toronto don't care about anyone basically outside of a radius of 50 miles of Toronto. So even people in Ontario who live up north, a lot of them a lot of them voted for Rob Ford, or sorry, for
Doug
Doug
Ford.
Ford's party
Yes.
because there was the sense that people in Toronto were elitists and they didn't care about them. So yeah, there is that definitely that sense, and I think that's like one of the images that people from Toronto try to avoid, but it's always there to some extent.
So when you go out on vacation, are you okay with saying you're from Toronto?
I think usually I go to cities when I go to vacation like Montreal, and I think I don't think they have prejudice against Toronto specifically. They are prejudiced against English Canada, but not in the same way that people from the West are prejudiced against Toronto. That being said, I haven't been to Western Canada, so except like when I was very young, I went to Alberta. I don't really remember what they thought about us when we went there, so I can't really say. But I would assume that there would be some sort of disconnect.
Yeah, I mean, obviously for me, it's been very interesting growing up because I was, from Wisconsin, and then I also lived in North Carolina for a while, and then I moved to Kentucky. So I've experienced a different range. I still haven't experienced much of the West Coast. I've only been to Arizona. So
Well, see, from my point of view, that's very interesting because I tend to see them as very similar. They're basically all like the Midwest to me. I don't really see much of a difference between like Wisconsin and Kentucky, except maybe Kentucky's more southern. But other than that, it's basically the same thing, and I don't really see much of a difference that people that you
well,
mentioned, for
Kentucky's
example.
not much different. I will say North Carolina was kind of different because in North Carolina it was the people who had money and influence were like East Coast money and
Yeah,
influence.
yeah. Basically, an extension of the Northeast, I guess.
Yeah, well, basically there was this suburb by where we lived, and it was called Cary, Cary, and they joked that
Oh,
that stood for the containment area for relocated Yankees.
that's funny. Oh, that. By the way, there's just an aside. The word Yankee is really interesting because people outside of the U.S. use Yankee just to mean Americans. People in the southern U.S. use Yankee to mean Northerners.
Oh yes, I've been called a Yankee before.
Yeah. So it's
Well,
very interesting that people are called Yankees in the South, but they also call others Yankees.
well, and I find it kind of odd to call me a Yankee being from Wisconsin because Wisconsin was sort of on the fence with the Civil War. It didn't really. Yes, they did send troops, but it wasn't like New York State, who's really, fiery about it.
Well, Wisconsin was more of a territory back then, I think.
Right? No,
Or
it actually didn't gain statehood until 1848,
yeah, so
much
that
later than everything around it.
yeah, I
Okay,
think I
go
think there's
ahead.
just yeah, I think there's just more of an association that Yankee means American in the same way that England means the United Kingdom
Yeah, I would
because
say
it's
that's
like the
fair.
dominant area.
Yeah, that's fair. Although I wonder if you look at the shifting mean center of the American population, it's a little more likely that the average American is southwestern.
Yeah, that's quite possible, especially in the last few years with the demographic boom in the South and West.
If you
I th-
look at the largest cities in America, for example, in the top five, you have Los Angeles, Phoenix, and Houston.
yeah, I think historically most of the people in the eastern U.S. tended to be focused around a couple big cities, whereas when people spread out west, they would spread out in different directions, and they would tend to just expand their population. So that's why there's more of a spread out population in the west than the east, since it's more of a newer settlement.
So I think part of the interesting discussion here is in the differences between America and Canada
Yeah,
is that I guess we have a similar amount of land area, but obviously we're way less dense, or we have way more people than Canada. Um,
um, I think that I think the main counterpoint to that is well, yes, that is true. If you look at like temperature and climate, if you take the 50 kilometers north of the U.S. border, we're basically at the same density as the U.S. It's just
I
that here it's a lot colder, so by definition, it's harder to have the same population density. But otherwise, we would be the same. We would be have similar growth as the U.S. I think.
Well, I just bring that up because I think that's why, in a way, the U.S. has a lot more distinct regions.
Yeah,
It's a lot harder to nail down as one kind of culture.
yeah, that's definitely true. More the distinction here is between English Canada, French Canada, and the First Nations people. Those are the three main historical distinctions, and then more recently, you have a lot of immigrants coming from different countries, and that's only in the last maybe 30 or 40 years when those micro distinctions begin to become more significant. But otherwise, historically, those are the three main divisions in Canada, and they were very not as regionally defined the as the regions of the United States. Here, it was more cultural.
Okay, so I guess we'll move on to our sort of questions for the other side thing, since we kind of covered our backgrounds a whole
All right.
bunch. Do you got any questions for me?
Okay, I guess um, my one question I would have is: do you feel closer someone as someone who grew up in Wisconsin? Would you have felt closer to people in the Northeast or people in this, uh, like in the rest of the state? Like, if you grew up in a city in Wisconsin, are you culturally more like the New Yorker or the rest of Wisconsin?
That's a tricky question. I would say people who grew up on the southern part of Milwaukee Wisconsin, actually, the majority of the population is Milwaukee and south. I did three of the five largest cities are on the bottom southeastern 50 miles of coastline on Lake Michigan. So I would say those people have a lot more in common with Chicagoans than everywhere else in Wisconsin. But that all being said, Chicago and Wisconsin, in my opinion, have less in common with the New Englander.
Yeah, I guess the New England population is a lot older.
Yes, it's kind of like sort of the old money, new money thing. Chicago was. I don't know if you've read anything about how Chicago was at the turn of the century, the turn of 1900, not 2000, but
Yeah.
it was pretty wild, man. It was really
So
crazy.
so like the Wild West, but with banks.
Yeah, like the Wild West, except maybe slightly more civilized,
Yeah.
And in some ways, that hasn't really left Wisconsin and Chicago. It's people there. They I don't know. It's certainly not an old money kind of thing. There is people with old money in those places, but it's just not the same where you have the ties to sort of in New England or New York. I like to think of New England like the show Gilmore Girls, right?
Yeah.
The father has got these ties to the old world, right? That doesn't exist much in Wisconsin.
Yeah, and I guess there's a similar sense to an extent in California, I would say.
Yes,
Or or is that not really an apt comparison? Like, are
in
people in
some ways.
California, other than like being socially liberal on average, do they have a lot more in common in with the East than with the Midwest?
That's a tricky question because they're different. I would say they have a lot more in common almost with, I would say Asian and Latin America. They're I'm not trying. They are. There's a lot of people from a lot of
Yeah,
diverse culture there.
yeah, certainly demographically, but I guess more economically and culturally, I would say. Because
They
like,
are. They are. They do. They are like New York in a sense that they are very their news is kind of similar. Their ways are similar, but in some ways, Hollywood is not the same as New York broadcasting either.
oh, that's interesting. I guess New York would be more formal or old school, and
Yes, I
Hollywood is more
consider New York to
sensationalist.
yeah, I would say New York is more trying to be like London, if you will, and
Yeah,
Los Angeles and California. I don't really know what they're trying to be like. They're trying to be beyond that. They're trying to be
yeah,
postmodern.
yeah. That makes sense.
Yeah, that's what I'd say. So yes, no, neither one real like I said, neither one really has a lot in common with the Midwest or the Great Lakes side of America. You know.
I guess the follow up question to that is, what about like the rural areas? Because a lot of the I guess there's a lot of sense of kinship between different rural areas
Oh
to the
yes,
point where they would feel that they're both being ripped off by people in New York or California, regardless of what state they're in.
yes. I mean, it's the classic sort of trope or meme. Like when I lived in Indiana, I lived just outside of this college town there where the Indiana University is. It's called Bloomington, right? And they would constantly joke about how they're this blue island in a sea of red, right? Or
Yeah,
how, like, the farmers, the classic farmers, they're always like, they're coming after our cultural values, constantly. I mean, that's constantly the rhetoric there. It's not quite as bad in Wisconsin because there's a lot of independent voters in Wisconsin, and in Michigan it's a little more urban than that. But it's definitely a thing there.
yeah. I'm actually surprised in Indiana in how southern it is for a northern state,
It's
because
very southern for a northern state.
I always hear people with Confederate flags like they never
Everywhere
even
there.
fought for the Confederacy. I'm so confused by that as a Canadian. Like, it doesn't make sense.
There's a lot of things that don't make sense about America. That's what makes it beautiful. It's not supposed to work. Ron Paul said it's still an experiment.
Yeah, that's true.
Does Canada still feel like an experiment?
Uh, in some ways, yes, in the sense that I would say even less than the United States, we feel like we have our own sense of identity, which is why I guess a lot of people attach themselves to multiculturalism, because that's sort of the only thing that really defines Canada in the modern period. Because otherwise, we would either be American or British. So it's
Yeah,
sort
I
of like
guess
we have
that'll
a
lead
hard
into my
time
question.
defining ourselves. I would say compared to the U.S.
Well, it kind of helps we became a superpower. It makes it easier to find
Yeah.
yourself when you're a superpower. But Canada, I'll lead in with my question here. So, have you finally broken away from the crown identity? Are you
Uh,
finally away from the UK?
it depends on the generation that you were talking about. I don't think most millennials really care about it, except maybe some. I guess a few millennials who vote conservative. They might be pro British Crown, but otherwise, millennials really don't care about it. Uh, with Gen X and some Boomers, I think it's more split, and it tends to increase as you grow older because the people who are older they grew up during the time when we were under British influence. But
It's just
certainly in recent years, there's less of an attachment to the monarchy, and I think there's also a movement. I think it's very small, but it's probably growing to replace the monarchy once Queen Elizabeth dies. I guess the main issue is how to maintain political neutrality with a non-monarch as head of state.
well, you saw what we had to do, so
Yeah, but I mean like you guys don't really have a parliamentary system, so that's not really an issue for you. But like I always like to say that we should do what India and Germany do. They either appoint their president based on candidates selected by the parliament, and they have to be nonpartisan. And I think that's a good model to follow because they both use the parliamentary system, but they also have a president instead of a monarch.
yes, it's very interesting. I think that I really admire some ways they do government, but they also have their problems in other ways too. I guess I asked that question because, you know, when I talked to John and I talked to Malik, John was from Australia and Malik's
Yeah.
from New Zealand. It seemed like they both still feel like their countries are very connected to England,
Oh yeah,
which
there's definitely more of a connection in Australia and New Zealand. I would say there's still a significant connection in Canada, but I would say probably less due to our proximity to the United States culturally. I would say uh, probably before 1970, we were all equally pro monarchy.
that's
And now
interesting.
it's not that Canada is anti monarchy because I don't think anyone would actually want to change the status quo. I just don't think they actually feel attached to it.
I just find it very interesting, being an American. The only thing we do is still speak English,
Yeah.
and I don't even know why, frankly. Like, we don't
Yeah,
really need to.
I'm surprised you don't speak German because German was the dominant language at one point.
Yeah, well, it's funny you should talk about that
Like
because one vote, man, one vote. Right after the revolution, Benjamin Franklin had a vote to try and change it to German, and it fell one vote short.
wow, that's
Pennsylvania actually is very German. I don't know if you knew that.
yeah. I that would be the with the Amish and the Pennsylvania Dutch, correct? I think.
Right. Which was a misspeak. They're not actually Dutch. They were
Yeah, because
Deutsch.
Dutch is the German word for German.
Yes. So yeah, no, yeah, and as you know, I'm German, and my family is German American on both sides. So it feels really odd because I would say the Midwest was set up by Germans
Yeah,
largely.
a lot of Germans and Scandinavians, if I remember.
Yeah, and it just I don't. So whenever there's like New Englanders and people saying things like the UK is our most important ally and stuff like that, I just feel so weirded out.
Yeah, I think definitely think that there's a big ethnic difference that doesn't necessarily show up that you can see, but you can certainly feel it in terms of like your political allegiance. For example, I remember reading about the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists and how the Federalists favored Britain and the Anti-Federalists favored France. I think.
Right, yes, that was a big thing. I'm actually this is very funny. So there's been this play going around about Hamilton,
Yeah, I've
Alexander
heard of it.
Hamilton. Yeah. I always find that so odd that people are championing that because like he was a real dirtbag, man. Like, yes, he was very important to our monetary system, but like he legitimately thought like the people shouldn't vote.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of people forget that a lot of the founding fathers were a bit elitist in some sense.
Right. I mean, and even my favorite founding father, Thomas Jefferson, was to a degree, but not on that level.
Yeah,
That's a whole nother level. And Benjamin Franklin, I don't really think was that much either. But yeah,
yeah. I think he was one of the. Him and Jefferson were, I guess, one of the least bad founding fathers in terms of their disdain for the common person. I guess.
yes, they like the common person largely.
Actually, there was a big issue with Thomas Jefferson. I remember reading about how he went like over and beyond. He basically contradicted his initial anti-federalist views when he expanded the West because he basically gave the federal government a bunch of power, which a lot of people said was hypocritical of him to do.
Yes, and he and Jackson both kind of did that, and both were claiming to be anti-federalist, and they justified it to themselves by saying it was because they got so much more land for the common folk. And I guess that did play out that way, but it's still a contradiction.
Yeah. Um. I guess it's I guess it's also interesting because comparing it, the expansion of the United States, the expansion of Canada, our expansion was a lot. It occurred much more recently, and in some cases, the expansion and development of the West isn't complete because, like Lucy was saying earlier, Greyhound cut their services to the West because it's basically as desolate as the U.S. Wild West was like 100 years ago, in many
Yeah,
places.
that's the other thing that was very sort of mind blowing to me is while in one hand you have very modern places like Toronto and Vancouver, you're still not interconnected like the United States is.
Yeah, because like I said, it's 100 years later, so I guess we're at the stage of the Wild West in that sense, in terms of like the infrastructure of the of Western Canada compared to Eastern Canada, which is probably another big reason why a lot of Western Canadians feel alienated.
Now, is it Calgary or is it Edmonton that has that big Wild West festival? I saw it on an episode of Globe Trekker. Don't they have like
Probably Calgary. Let me check.
yeah, they have a big thing where it's like they got a big old rodeo that happens there.
Yeah, there's a lot of Western culture in Alberta. It would be in
I think it's Calgary.
Fort McMurray, I believe.
Okay, yeah. But I saw this big festival. I was like, wow, that looks like even more Western than the Old West.
Yeah, yeah, it's really interesting how a lot of commonalities there are in between Western Canada and the Western U.S., especially Alberta.
Well, all the Rockies are the same, so.
Yeah.
Let's see. Okay, so one other thing that I really thought is funny to talk about, and it brings in the Great Lakes well, is talking about. I had a student I tutored once who was from Toronto, and
Okay.
she believed you all won the War of 1812.
Oh, that's interesting.
Like she's like, that's how it's taught there.
I guess it depends. It depends how you interpret it because at that point it was British. It was British. It was Canadian. The Canadian people uh, weren't really British. It was at that point Canadian meant something very different as it means now. In 1812, Canadian meant French Canadian. So when they say the British won the War of 1812, I guess
They're talking about the British.
when they say the Canadians won the War of 1812 versus the British, I guess it's trying to define your identity versus the fact that you were still basically a colony. Because but by then the Canadian identity was basically French, and the British were basically foreigners at that point. They had only ruled Canada for about maybe 40 or 50 years. So at that point, I guess there wasn't much of an attachment to Britain like there was in the early 1900s, and I guess that's why people feel weird seeing that Britain. Britain won the War of 1812, because sort of like admitting that we were dominated by Britain, even
I
though we didn't
see.
really feel connected to it. That's my understanding of it.
So are you a big War of 1812 buff? Like, because that's a
Um,
big deal
I'm not I'm,
event up
I'm
there.
not really obsessed with it, but I've read about it, and basically my interpretation is that it was a stalemate and both sides sort of gave up.
Well, in one sense, it was a stalemate. In one
Like
sense,
or
England
like
kind of won.
or like not so much that they gave up, but both sides claimed that they won, and they
Both
just
sides
decided.
claim win, and nobody really, I guess, technically won. But I mean, it really damaged us. But I guess at the end, I don't feel like England was really all that bled dry from it. They just didn't want to fight it anymore.
Yeah, it was mostly just because, remember, was it the Federalist or the Anti-Federalist Party governing the U.S. at that point? I can't
Uh,
remember.
it was anti-federalist, but that was actually what pretty much killed the Federalists because they were pro making peace with England.
Yeah, so the at that point there were basically the U.S. was very close to France, and Britain hated France at that point because Napoleon was conquering all of Europe, and
Right.
they thought that uh, he was going to threaten British shipping to the east, and that's why they wanted to be. They thought the U.S. was too sympathetic to France, which is why I get that was sort of like the deeper causes of the war, basically.
Right. Yeah, and sort of yeah. So when who Monroe was president during the War of 1812, and he was a Jefferson disciple, basically. So he was anti-federalist, and then the Federalists were like, "Oh, we gotta make peace with them. We're gonna go broke. All of our money is English," and then their party died because of that.
Oh yeah, and then out of the anti-federalists came the Democrats and Republicans, I think, or the
Before
Democrat
that,
Republicans.
actually, the Whigs. This is
Yeah, the
actually
Whigs.
where this really gets interesting. Okay, so the Anti-Federalists basically became the Democrats under Jackson, but they weren't Democrats like people think of Democrats today.
Yeah,
They were they were they were very conservative and pro the farmer and didn't really care about most of any kind of social
they were
values.
basically Jeffersonian, right?
To an extent, although they were more big government than they like to admit. Yeah, they were, yes. I mean, they would claim that Jefferson was their influence.
It's sort of like right now how Trump is claiming that he's going to protect the farmers by giving them a subsidy, which is basically big government, even though he claims to be against big government.
Yes. Trump, in a lot of ways, I say this all the time. He is the modern Andrew Jackson. Like
Oh yeah.
he like took the playbook practically, except he hasn't won a battle in a war. But it's just really funny though because it's so weird. It's like nobody sees it though. It's like it's very obvious, but nobody sees it. It's probably because I think it's because we have full length movies about people like Washington and Jefferson and Lincoln and Roosevelt, but there's never been one made about Jackson, and that's what
Oh
the problem is.
yeah. I've actually never seen one in Jackson.
Yeah, there isn't one. There's one PBS documentary about him, and that's about it.
Okay.
And I think that's rather sad because, in a lot of ways, he, in my opinion, is the most American president.
More so than Lincoln.
Yes, he represents what America is. The contradictions all wrapped into one.
Oh
The,
yeah.
the the guy who does the Trail of Tears but has an Indian stepchild he adopted,
Oh yeah. That
or
part. That part was weird.
the guy who defends his wife to the end, claiming defending her honor, but went away and eloped with her when she was married to another man.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Like there seem to be a
He,
lot of contradictions that are based in modern both American and Canadian identity. I would say.
right. So that's why I think he's a figure that people don't examine enough. A lot of people, when they talk about him, you get sort of. He used to actually not get quite as tarnished as today, but people just, they just say, oh, he was terrible, the Trail of Tears. But it's like they don't look into everything about it. I think it's very fascinating. He to me is the most interesting president.
Oh yeah. Um. Now, if I remember correctly, I find it's really interesting that around the time of the U.S. Civil War, that's when the movement to establish Canada was started.
Right.
It's sort of like
Yes.
a bit of a side note. That was when they began to fear the idea of the U.S. manifest destiny. That was like that's like what led them to fear U.S. economic dominance of Canada.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean that was basically. I don't know if you've heard of James K. Polk, but I mean that was basically the whole gist. We were gonna take over the whole West. I mean it was completely his whole ideology almost.
Wait, was he pre or post Civil War?
He was pre-Civil War, but not much before it. He was 1844.
Okay, I see.
Yes, and he was very popular. And he only did one term though. He just retired afterward because he accomplished all of his goals in one term,
Oh wow.
including basically annexing most of the West.
And that was around the time California was established, or was that
Yes,
after?
that was also around when California was established, and just before he became president, we annexed Texas.
Oh yeah, Texas is weird because basically a bunch of American settlers from the South came to Mexico, and they had slaves apparently,
Oh
and
yeah,
they felt that the Mexican government was infringing on their liberty to have slaves, which is strange. And they were
yeah. There's
also
a dark
they were
history there.
yeah they were technically illegal immigrants in Mexico. So I find it ironic that a lot of people talk about illegal immigrants in Mexico.
Yeah, it's funny. So I guess a question I have for you then is sort of so in American history we have these very recognizable figures, right? That a lot of people talk about
Yeah.
still. What are some from Canada or the Great Lakes region of Canada?
I guess in Canada in general, first I would say our first prime minister was Johnny MacDonald, who is sort of like uh uh I guess he would be more comparable to Jackson and Jefferson in that they were very controversial, but they were also very popular at the same time. Uh, I think he was from Ottawa or around the Ottawa area, I believe. Let me check.
Okay.
Um, he was born in. Oh, he was actually born in Scotland, but he lived in Ottawa. I see. Because
Ah, I see.
a lot of the founding fathers of Canada were basically British immigrants.
I mean that was the same for America as well.
Yeah. So he was basically one of the prominent people from that time. Another person was William Lloyd Mackenzie, who was the prime minister during the early 1900s. That was when we developed our pro-British trade strategy, and
Ah, I see.
there was this huge debate about whether we should trade with the U.S. or with the U.K. And he basically aligned ourselves with the UK and established strong tariffs against the US, which basically lasted until the post-war period.
Interesting.
Then I think another major figure would be uh, Lester B. Pearson. He was a prime minister during the early Cold War. He was involved a lot in terms of diplomacy and making doing peace deals in the Middle East and Africa around that time. So that's sort of when Canada began to get this reputation of being peacekeepers. So I guess those are like the three prominent people, and then there's also Eric Raju, who is probably another figure who's both very popular and very controversial.
Oh, the Trudeau Senior.
Yeah, probably the more recent one. In because he was the one who really established modern Canada. He basically under him he made the final amendments to the Constitution, which basically said that the British Parliament didn't need to approve any changes to Canadian law, which prior to that was basically the only thing that kept us to under the British Crown. It was basically like a formalism. It was never really applied, and it was sort of a nuisance. So they sort of that was like the completion of Canada's emergence as an independent identity. And
Ah.
also during this time, there was a big controversy around Quebec's independence, which is when he established bilingualism as the federal policy in order to appease Quebec. But this also got made a lot of people in English Canada very angry. It felt what they felt like it was a concession towards them. Around this time, uh, there were a lot of uh, radical, both left wing and right wing terrorist activities in Quebec, which led to uh, Trudeau essentially enacting martial law. I think it
Oh
was
wow.
yeah, that was like really insane. That was like for a few months, and that was like he was like really good. He was really popular until the last few years of his tenure in office, and basically that period was very intense. Multiculturalism was basically enacted in Canada at that time. A lot of things that we recognize as modern Canada were established during Trudeau's tenure in office.
It's very interesting you bring that up about being really popular yet controversial towards the end. I have a book here that is the premise that goes on the premise what would have happened if Lincoln didn't get assassinated.
I see. And is there, I guess, the sense that he could have kept the country together, or was it inevitable that there would be civil war?
It's actually quite dark. It basically has his party calling him a traitor and trying to take him down constantly, which
So
is
basically what's happening with Trump right now.
well, in some ways. Have you ever heard that French expression? It's the more things change, the
The
more they
more they
stay
see
the
the
same.
scene, yeah.
That's how I see the Republican Party. So, but yeah, no. Basically, the radical Republicans during Lincoln's tenure, they wanted to basically punish the South. I mean, they wanted to, just overthrow everything about it.
Yeah, and that's why I guess a lot of the South became uh, destroyed during that time during Reconstruction, which is, I
Yeah,
guess, ironically named because they're
right,
reconstructing what they destroyed.
right. And so it makes it very weird, then in the 1960s when Nixon campaigned and won the South, and now it's, like I said, it's flipped. It's very strange in a way, because the Republican Party was actually started in Wisconsin.
Oh, really?
Yeah, as just a purely anti-slavery party, and no one ever expected to win.
Well, that's funny.
Yeah, and now it's this big. Now it may be the party that lasts. I don't know. So I guess what's your? Let's see. We'll hit a couple more subjects and then we'll sign it off here.
Sure.
But what's your opinion? I guess on Quebec. You brought that up. I mean, that is the hot topic, right?
Yeah.
Should they be allowed to be their own country? What's going on there?
So a lot of the issues with Quebec is that I I I think that even if they were to be their own country, I don't really see how they would be economically viable, and they would basically be end up being dependent on Canada and the United States anyway.
I see.
Because much like Canada, Quebec is basically consists of a bunch of cities on the St. Lawrence River, and basically, if you go north, is basically farms, a few native reserves, and that's it. So there's very little uh, viability, I think, for uh, a Quebec national state to emerge as an independent country. And furthermore, also I'm not really sure that an independent Quebec would preserve the rights of the linguistic minorities in Quebec, which is why I think having Quebec as an autonomous province of Canada is the best way to preserve both the dominance of French in the region while also protecting the rights of non francophones.
Interesting. Okay. And then the other subject I was going to touch on was what was it here?
Oh,
So
and
what?
sorry, I just wanted to add something that a big issue in Quebec is this thing called Bill 101,
Oh,
and it's basic. I think I mentioned it to you where they basically you have to use French in the public sphere. Before, if you use English, French has to be more prominent, and I think a lot of people sort of misunderstand, I guess, the reasoning behind that, and especially a lot of businesses really don't like that. But I think the main reason for that is essentially so that the French language survives in North America, because otherwise, there's no other place in North America where French has survived. And I think that's like really the only really radical action that by the Quebec government that I would support. I think.
so you support that? You support their cultural separation in a way.
Yeah, basically cultural separation makes sense, but not economic separation.
Interesting. I see what you're saying. Okay, and the last question I had was: do you think that the United States Midwestern region needs to allow itself to be less isolationist, or sort of needs to, I don't know, reform how it is? Does it need to be more, I don't know, act more like the coast?
I guess it depends in what we were talking about. So if you're talking about being more connected to the rest of the world, being more internationally minded, then yeah, I think it would be a good idea for the Midwest to be connected to the coast. But at the same time, I guess there's sort of like a warning from history that the people in the Midwest, if they follow the coast, they shouldn't, I guess, lose touch with who they are as a people and become elitist. So there's sort of like you have to strike that balance. On the one
Yes.
hand, be connected to other places. On the other hand, basically not lose touch with who you are.
Should we start making a pro German law in the Midwest?
Ooh, I'm not sure if that would be feasible, but I think if it were possible to do that, I think it would, at the very least, it would be a good idea to introduce German education in public schools, like in kindergarten and preschool. And
You heard it here from the horse's mouth.
yeah, elementary school, uh, in and preschool should give the option of doing German, and by the same token, they should also give the option of doing Spanish.
There it goes from the horse's mouth. Well, cool. This has been really great chat. Like I said, I think in a lot of ways we're similar, in some ways we're different, but I think we have a lot more in common actually than sort of the other regions of our countries.
Which is really strange because a lot of people in Eastern Canada tend to be close to New England, and a lot of people in Western Canada tend to be close to California. Yet we're sort of in the middle, and we sort of feel close to each other because we're forced to basically coexist.
Basically, that's what I constantly say is that no, I don't try and make this claim that the Midwest is like a tolerant place or something, but in a way, you can have any view and be in the Midwest. You know, you can
Yeah,
survive.
I think that's. I actually think it's more possible to be uh, more radically left wing or right wing in the Midwest than it is in on the coast. I feel like in the coast, people are more aligned with the center and with the establishment, whereas people are more likely to be populist in one direction or the other in the Midwest.
Yeah, you heard another one from the horse's mouth there. Well,
Well,
anyway,
that's just my observation based on like the vote distribution from the states in the 2016 election.
well, I don't even need to make my arguments anymore. Everybody else is making them for me. Well, it's been really great talking, and we'll definitely have to do this again sometime. So thanks. Thanks for coming on, Eric. Is there anything else you want to say about Toronto or Canada?
Uh, I guess basically, I guess people. I just like people for in other countries to stop assuming that Canadians are basically the same as Americans.
Well, I would
I
never
feel like
assume that.
I feel like that's really ironic because in some ways Americans are more likely to feel that Canadians are a distinct identity, whereas if you go to other countries, they sort of oh you're basically like Americans. Unless you say that you're Canadian, they assume that you're American, which I find is annoying.
You have to clearly whenever you go to another country, you're just gonna have to rock the flag shirts.
Yeah.
I don't know what else you could do. I guess you could put on like hockey stuff all the time. Anyway, there you go. Well, I'm gonna sign us off here. It's been great, man.
Same here. See ya.